Shalom, shalom, Yisrael. It's your brother Benayah Ben Israel coming to you with a quick video on 400 years. Awaken, restore, prepare. That's 400 years. Awaken, restore, prepare. Well, I'm sure you've probably noticed, you can't help but notice it, but the wheels on the bus of the daughter of Babylon are coming off. There's all sorts of turmoil that's occurring in the daughter of Babylon, as well as around the world with all of the plagues that are hitting, the signs that we're seeing, the prophetic dreams that we're having. We know that we are living in the season of the last days. And we are also living in the season of the fulfillment of the prophetic 400 years. Now, if you're wondering, what is this prophetic 400 years that I'm talking about? Well, let's take a quick look. Let's take a look at Genesis chapter 15, verse 13. That's Genesis chapter 15, verse 13. And it reads, "And he said unto Abraham, Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. All right. So a couple of key takeaways from this verse is that the 400 years is associated with servitude or slavery and affliction. So as we go through these scriptures, it's important that we look for those two key things, right? We're looking for a people that have been in servitude or enslaved, and the people that are being afflicted or oppressed. So those are the things that we're looking for when we look for the fulfillment of the 400 years. And let's take a look at the next verse. So we're currently looking at verse 13, but if we go over to the next verse, it reads, "And also that nation," so we're talking about a servitude to a particular nation. "So that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterwards shall they come out with great substance." And now that's Genesis chapter 15, verse 14. So a couple of takeaways from here. It's servitude to a particular nation, and also a nation that is associated with the Most High Yah's judgment. Okay, so here's just another screenshot of the information that we're looking for. We're looking for a people that have been enslaved and a people that have been afflicted for 400 years. Just want to make sure we get that point across. As we're going through these scriptures, we are looking for a people that have been enslaved and a people that have been afflicted for 400 years. We are not just looking for people that have sojourned for 400 years or 430 years. We are looking for a people that have been enslaved and afflicted for 400 years. So you may wonder, all right, so why is that important? Well, it's important because when we say that the 400 years refers to the so-called African Americans, we have a couple of things that we could point out. We can say that 400 years occurred in America. So in 1619, most of you are aware that this year, we commemorated, especially I believe it was in August of the 21st or 22nd of August, we commemorated the arrival of the first so-called African to the English colonies of the United States, or what would eventually turn out to be the United States. So that occurred in 1619. So here we are in 2019, 400 years later, we are at the cusp, or we are in the 400 years, right? So that is one of the prerequisites, was that, we are people that have been in this country for 400 years. The thing that we're looking for two key requirements: enslavement and persecution for 400 years. Those are the two things we're looking for. So, and we know that the so-called African American has definitely been enslaved and definitely have been persecuted for 400 years. Now, just want to point out a couple of things that the slavery that the so-called African American was a part of, it was a slavery of a biblical scale, of biblical proportions, right? This wasn't just a small slavery that we're talking about. We're talking about the transatlantic slave trade. When you mention the transatlantic slave trade, they know what you're talking about. And also, the slavery of the so-called African American is a slavery to the daughter of Babylon, right? And that's key, because remember, in the previous scripture that we read, the slavery was a slavery to a particular nation, which the daughter of Babylon is a particular nation, or in some scriptures it's referred to as a nation. And then also it is in slavery to a nation that the Most High Yah will judge. And if you know the scriptures associated with the daughter of Babylon will definitely be judged when Yahshua returns, right? And then, we can also point out that persecution continues to this day. And, we know that there's, we can see calamity about us, with all this stuff with the what's going on with the president and all this other stuff. We know that there's just calamity just all around us, not only in the daughter of Babylon, but also around the world. You can see plagues, you can see all these different things that are happening in these different countries. So that's, the so-called African American, so far we're able to check off quite a few boxes for the so-called African American. But really the two main ones that we want to make sure that we can check off is that they were enslaved and persecuted for 400 years, right? Enslaved and persecuted for 400 years. So check and check. But let's take a look at Egypt, because that's another thought that, well, maybe 400 years was served in Egypt. So let's take a quick look at that. So you'll notice that I have question marks when it comes to the number of years in Egypt, because there's questions about that. And we'll take a quick look at that. And then also the enslavement and the persecution in Egypt, there's also questions about that. So we need to find out if Israel, if our forefathers were enslaved and persecuted in Egypt for 400 years. And Most High willing, at the end of this video, you'll be able to know that or answer that without a shadow of a doubt. All right. Well, let's go on to our next page here. So, for example, I wanted to show you that there are some scriptures and there is some confusion when it comes to Egypt. So let's take a quick look at Exodus chapter 12, verse 40. That's Exodus chapter 12, verse 40. And I'm just going to jump over to my my web browser. So bear with me just for a second. So Exodus. All right. So here's Exodus chapter 12, verse 40. And it reads, "Now the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years." So I just wanted to bring this scripture out just to show you that this is one of the scriptures that some may point to and say, well, aha, this is where the children of Israel have lived in Egypt for 400 years. Well, a couple of things I want to point out. One is, remember, we have two requirements. We're not just looking for sojourning somewhere for 430 years or 400 years. We are looking for a people that have been enslaved and oppressed or afflicted for 400 years, right? So that's what we're looking for. And then the other thing to point out about this reference is depending on which Bible you're looking at. So we're looking, I prefer to use the King James Bible. I'm not a big fan of using these newer, I call them the daughter of Babylon Bibles, Bibles that were created in the daughter of Babylon. I'm not a big fan of that. I prefer, my preference, just my personal preferences for the King James Bible. We know that it has errors in it, and I'm just going to show you one of the errors in it. But I still feel that it's just one of the better of the Bibles that's out there. All right. So just to show you the error that I'm talking about. So here we're looking at Exodus chapter 12, verse 40. And this is one of those verses that misleads folks because there's an error associated with it where it says, "Now the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 400 years. However, if you look at the Septuagint, which is the older Bible, you'll notice that this one reads a little bit differently. And it says, "And the sojourning of the children of Israel while they sojourned in the land of Egypt and Canaan." So that was missing from King James. "And the land of Canaan, 430 years." So that part was dropped off when we take a look at the King James Bible, right? So the older Bible has this phrase, "and the land of Canaan," and the King James Bible doesn't have it. So this is what throws folks off, right? It's what throws folks off. All right, so just wanted to show you that. let's get back to our presentation. I just wanted to show you that as an example of what we're going to look for. So we're going to look for, 400 years of Israel being enslaved and persecuted. And whenever we come across scriptures about 400 years, we want to make sure that we're always looking for those two things. Because when we don't do that, that's going to throw us off. That's what causes confusion when people try to figure out where this 400 years of servitude occurred. Okay, so we're going to take a quick look at Egypt. So Egypt, whenever we try to apply the 400 years to Egypt, we run into math problems. We run into 2 + 2 = 8. All right, so what do you mean by that, Brother Benayah? Well, you remember when you were, most of us were in the Christian church. And when we were in the Christian church, we were, some of us observed Easter, and we knew about the Easter and the Hamashiach, the Messiah. He died on Friday and rose up Sunday morning. At least that's what they told us, right? He was in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights, right? And that's what they told us. But we had a math problem there. We said, well, how could the Messiah die on Friday, be in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights, and get up on Sunday morning? That's not 3 days. You can't get 3 days, 3 nights out of that. So we had a math problem. And based on that math problem, we knew that something wasn't right. Right? We knew something wasn't right. And what I'm going to show you is that when we take a look at Egypt, when we try to apply or make Egypt be the place of the 400 years of servitude, or 400 years of servitude and affliction, we start to run into math problems. And let me show you what I mean. So for this exercise, we're just going to do a quick exercise. And for that, if you might want to grab a calculator. We're just going to add 3 numbers together, but a calculator would make it just so much easier to use, or to get the numbers. But all we're going to do is count. So that's all we're going to do is count. All right. So the first thing we're going to do, we're going to take a look at Genesis chapter 46. Genesis chapter 46. So we're going to take a look at Israel going down into Egypt. So we're going to take a look at Israel going down into Egypt. And the whole point of us taking a look at these scriptures that we're going to take a look at is we want to see how long the children of Israel were in Egypt, and we want to see if the children of Israel were enslaved and afflicted for 400 years in Egypt as well. All right, so this is why we're going there. All right, so Genesis chapter 46. So let me jump over there. I'm just going to change my browser here just for a second. So chapter 46, and we're going to start at verse 8. Let's say, okay, so this chapter, just to give you some background, this chapter is talking about the children of Israel that are coming into Egypt. So these are the people that are kicking off their stay in Egypt, right? So these are the people that are kicking off, or that are starting the stay in Egypt. And you can see that in verse 8. So in chapter 46, verse 8, it says, "And these are the names of the children of Israel which came into Egypt: Jacob and his sons, Reuben, Jacob's firstborn." So it's going to go through all the people that came into Egypt, right? So these, I refer to these guys as the landing party. So this is the people that kicked it off. And if I just drop down to verse 11, and we're continuing to see who else came into Egypt, who was part of that initial party. Verse 11 tells us, "And the sons of Levi, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari." But the most important name in these names here is Kohath. So we see that Kohath is one of the people that were part of the initial 70 people, 70 souls or whoever, that came down into Egypt. And if you're wondering, all right, so what's important about Kohath? Well, Kohath is Moshe, or Moses's grandfather. Not his great-grandfather, not his great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. Kohath is Moshe's, or Moses's grandfather, right? So at the start of the children of Israel sojourning in Egypt, we have Kohath starting the 400 years, or the stay in Egypt, right? The stay in Egypt. All right, so now that we know that, let's take a look at a few things. Let's do something very simple. we're going to look to see how long Kohath lived. So we see Kohath coming into Egypt. So let's see how long he lived, right, in Egypt, or how long he lived in general. And we can find that in Exodus chapter 6. So Exodus chapter 6, and let's start at verse 18. And it says, "And the sons of Kohath, Amram, and Izhar, and Hebron, and Uzziel, and the years of the life of Kohath were 133 years." So basically, Kohath, who's coming into Egypt, he lives 133 years. All right. And let's see. So Kohath has a son called Amram. You can see that in verse 18. Amram is important because Amram is Moshe's or Moses's father, right? Amram is Moshe's or Moses's father. So let's take a look to see how long Amram lived. And for that, let's drop down to verse 20. And it says, "And Amram took him Jochebed, his father's sister, to wife. And she bare him," oh, listen, "Aaron and Moses." So we have Aaron and Moses coming on the scene. And it says, "And the years of the life of Amram were 137 years." So far we have Kohath coming into Egypt. He lives 133 years. Then we have his son Amram, who lives 137 years. Now we have Moshe, we have Moses. So let's see how long Moses lived, right? Because Moses was the one that took the children of Israel out of Egypt. So you can already see that we're starting to run into a problem when we want to say that the children of Israel were in Egypt for 400 years, because it's really three people that's involved. Kohath brings them in, Moshe brings them out. And we have Kohath, Amram, Moshe. That's just three generations, three people, right? So Kohath brings them in, Moshe brings them out. But let's check one thing. We just need to do a quick check. We want to see how long or how old Moshe was when he took the children of Israel out of Egypt. And for that, we can go to Exodus, the book of Exodus, chapter 7, verse 7. So Exodus chapter 7, verse 7, and it reads, "And Moshe, or Moses, was 80 years old, and Aaron 83 years old, when they spake to Pharaoh." So remember when Moshe, Moses, and Aaron kept speaking to Pharaoh to let the Most High's people go. So Moshe was 80 years old. How old is 80 years old? Let's do a quick look at the Webster dictionary. And Webster tells us 80, and it says definition of 80 being 4 times 20 is 80. So Moshe was 80 years old when he took the children of Israel out of Egypt. All right. So let's get back over to our PowerPoint, because now we have all the information that we need in order to add a few numbers up to see how long the children of Israel were in Egypt, or to see how long the children of Israel were not in Egypt. And you'll see what I mean here. So just a brief recap. So we have Kohath, which is Moshe's grandfather. He goes into Egypt, and we read Exodus 6, verse 16. And then we reviewed Amram. It should be Amram down there. It reads Arm, but it should read Amram. But then we reviewed Amram when we saw Amram lived 137 years, right? And that was Moshe's father. And we read that in Exodus 7, chapter 7, verse 7. And then last but not least, we took a look and we saw that Moses was 80 years old when the children of Israel left Egypt. So now we have some numbers we can add together. Let's add Kohath, who brought the children of Israel. Let's read Kohath. Let's take Kohath's 133 plus Amram's 137 plus Moshe's 80. These are the numbers. And that gives us 350 years, maximum possible years that the children of Israel could have been in Egypt, because you just have those three people. But we know that it was actually less than 350 years. But this is the maximum number of years that that the children of Israel could possibly have been in the land of Egypt, right? 350 years. Kohath, 133 years, plus Amram, 137 years, plus Moshe's 80 years equals 350 years. So you can see that there's a math problem here when we try to say that the children of Israel sojourned in Egypt for 400 years, and that this is the fulfillment of the 400-year prophecy. But wait, there's more. There's another math problem, and it has to do with the timing of enslavement and persecution in Egypt. So let's take a look at that. So first problem we found was that the people involved in the Israel going into Egypt, we found that when we took a look at the people that brought in the children of Israel and took them out, we found out that that was less than 400 years. All right, so let's take a look at Israel's enslavement and persecution in Egypt. So for that, I'm going to jump back over to my my web browser, and let's take a look at Acts. Let's go to the book of Acts, chapter 7, and we're going to read about Stephen. Now, this is one of the scriptures that folks go to say, hey, this is Stephen proves without a shadow of a doubt that the children of Israel were in Egypt for 400 years. Not only that, this is the fulfillment of the 400-year prophecy. However, there's a couple of things that I'm going to show you, and we're going to read it slow, that people often miss when coming over to Stephen. So let's take a look. So let's start with Acts chapter 7, verse 2. So Acts chapter 7, verse 2. And like I said, again, we're coming over here to see how long the children of Israel were enslaved and oppressed or persecuted in Egypt. And we'll start off in verse 2, and it reads, "And he said, Men, brethren, and fathers, hearken. The Elohim of glory appeared unto our father Abraham, and when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Charan, and said unto him, Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred, and come into the land which I shall show thee. Then came he out of the land of the Chaldeans, and dwelt in Charan. And from thence, when his father was dead, he removed him into this land, wherein you dwell now. And he gave him none inheritance in it, not so much as to set his foot on. Yet he promised that he would give it to him for possession." Listen, it says, and yet he promised that he would give it to him for a possession. So what we're reading about in Acts is the promise. So this is the promise that the Most High gave Abraham. And it says he would give it to him for possession and to his seed after him, when as yet he had no child. So remember, Abraham had no child. So this is verse 5. But let's go down to verse 6. I believe this is where we start to run into some confusion. So let's take a look at verse 6, where it says, "And Elohim spake on this wise, that his seed should sojourn in a strange land, and that they should bring them into bondage and entreat them evil 400 years. Okay. All right. So a couple of things about verses 5 and verses 6. Verses 5 and verses 6 are two different prophecies given at two different times. I'll say that again. Verses 5 and verses 6 are two different prophecies given at two different times. However, because they are grouped together here in Acts chapter 7, we tend to lump them together, and that throws us off. So I'll tell you what, let's take a look at this very same account. Let's go to the source. We're going to go over to the book of Genesis chapter 15. So if you have your Bibles, go over to Genesis chapter 15, and we're going to read about the promise as well as the 400 years. This is where it occurred. So what Stevens is doing, Stevens is recounting this occurrence in Genesis chapter 15. And let's start at verse 2, and it reads, "And Abraham said, Elohim Yah, what wilt thou give me, seeing I go childless? And the steward of my house is this Eliezer of Damascus. And Abraham said, Behold, To me thou hast given no seed, and lo, one born in mine house is mine heir. And behold, the word of Yah came unto him, saying, This shall not be thine heir, but he that shall come forth out of thine own bowels shall be thine heir. Verse 5. And he brought him forth abroad and said, Look now toward heaven, and tell the stars, if thou be able to number them. And he said unto him, So shall thy seed be. And he believed in Yah, and he counted it to him for righteousness. Verse 7. And he said unto him, I am Yah that brought thee out of Ur of the Chaldees, to give thee this land to inherit. All right, so I just want to pause here just for a second, just so that you can see that this is the promise that Stephen is talking about in Acts. And I'm just going to jump back over to Acts just so that you can see that there's alignment, that Stephen is simply reading this account in Genesis. So we just read about the promise about the giving of the land. And we can actually see this in Acts chapter 7, verse 5, when Stephen says, And he gave him no inheritance in it, no, not so much as to set his foot on, yet he promised that he would give it to him for a possession, and to his seed after him, when as yet he had no child. Right? So, all right. So we just read that in Genesis. Now, in Stephen's account, the very next line or the very next verse then talks about the 400 years. Right? It says, And Elohim spake unto this wise, that his seed should sojourn in a strange land, that they should bring them into bondage and entreat them evil for 400 years. Right? However, like I said before, these are two different prophecies. So let's jump back over to Genesis. And I believe we left off at verse 7. So I'm just going to start at verse 6 again, where it says, And he believed in Yah, and he counted it to him for righteousness. Verse 7. And he said unto him, I am Yah that brought thee out of Ur of the Chaldees, to give thee this land to inherit it. All right. So that's the promise. That's in verse 5 in Acts chapter 7, verse 5. But let's keep reading. Let's see when we actually come to the prophecy of the 400 years. Let's go to verse 8. It says, And he said, Elohim Yah, whereby shall I know that I shall inherit it? And he said unto him, Take me an heifer of 3 years old, and a she-goat of 3 years old, and a ram of 3 years old, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he took upon him all these things, and divided them in the midst, and laid them each piece one against another. But the birds divided he not. And when the fowls came down upon the carcasses, Abraham drove them away. Now notice, we're still reading. We haven't come up to the 400 years yet, right? The 400-year prophecy yet. All right, so let's keep reading. And it says, verse 12, And when the sun was going down, so later in the day, and a deep sleep fell upon Abram. So now Abraham's going to sleep. And lo, an horror of great darkness fell upon him. And he said unto Abraham, Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. So again, the affliction, the servitude, the affliction should last 400 years. That is what we're looking for, right? For the fulfillment of this specific prophecy. And let's just read down just a little bit more. And it says, And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterward shall they come out with great substance. All right. So hopefully you can see that the two prophecies were given at two different times. The promise of Abraham receiving the land was given earlier in the day, but then the prophecy of the 400 years was given later in the day, or later in the evening. So now that we have that understanding, let's go back over to Stephen's and read. So we're going to pick that up again at verse 5. We're going to read about the two prophecies, one given in the earlier part of the day, and then the other prophecy given in the latter part of the day, right? We're going to make sure we understand that as we keep reading, and then we're going to keep reading to confirm that Stephen was not saying that the 400 years was in Egypt, because he actually confirms this further down in his reading. But let's start back with verse 5. Okay, let's pick it up at verse 5. And it says, and he gave none inheritance in it. No, not so much as to set his foot on. Yet he promised that he would give it to him for a possession, and to his seed after him, when as yet he had no child. Promise 1. And Elohim spake on this wise, that his seed should sojourn in a strange land, and that they should bring them into bondage and entreat them evil for 400 years. All right, so that's what we're looking for. This is the second prophecy given later in the day. And then verse 7, and that nation to whom they shall be in bondage will I judge, said Elohim. And after that shall they come forth, serve me in this place. Verse 8, and he gave him the covenant of circumcision. And so Abraham begat Isaac, and circumcised him on the 8th day, and Isaac begat Jacob, and Jacob begot the 12 patriarchs. All right, so we're going to keep reading to confirm or deny if Stephen was referring to Egypt for the 400 years. Verse 10, and it says, and delivered him out of all his affliction, and gave him favor and wisdom in the sight of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And he made him governor over Egypt in all his house. Now there came a dearth over all the land of Egypt and Canaan, and a great affliction, and our fathers found no substance. But when Jacob heard that there was corn in Egypt, he sent out our fathers first. And at the second time, Joseph made known to his brethren, and Joseph's kindred was made known unto Pharaoh. Then sent Joseph and called his father Jacob to him, and all his kindred, 75 souls. And remember, we read about this earlier. This is that landing party with Kohath that we're talking about, that Stephen's talking about. But let's keep reading. Verse 15. So Jacob went down into Egypt with Kohath and died, he and his fathers, and were carried over into Shechem and laid in a sepulchre that Abraham bought for a sum of money of the sons of Emor, the father of Shechem. But when the time of the promise drew nigh, so remember, now we're talking about the promise of land that was in verse 5. It says, but when the time of the promise drew nigh, and just go back up to verse 5 so you can read it, where it says, and he gave him no inheritance in it, no, not so much as to set his foot on, yet he promised that he would give it to him for a possession. So we're talking about that first prophecy that was given earlier in the day, is my point. All right, so let me drop back down to verse 17, where it says, but when the time of the promise drew nigh, which Elohim had sworn to Abraham, the people grew and multiplied in Egypt, till another king arose, which knew not Joseph. All right, so this is a key point. So up until this point, Israel, they weren't enslaved, and they weren't persecuted or afflicted, or they weren't oppressed or afflicted, till another king arose, which knew not Joseph. All right, so let's read the same account in Exodus. And let's go over to Exodus chapter 1. And let's pick this up at verse 5. And it reads, and all the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls, for Joseph was in Egypt already. And Joseph died, and all his brother in all that generation. And it says, verse 7, it says, and the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and waxed exceedingly mighty. And the land was filled with them. All right. So at verse 7, there's no enslavement. There's no oppression. Right. So we can't start that 400-year time clock yet. We need to see when the affliction or when the enslavement occurs in Egypt, so that we can see if that affliction or if that enslavement lasted for 400 years. You got it? All right. So in verse 7, it says the children of Israel were fruitful, and they increased abundantly, and they multiplied and waxed exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. So we haven't reached the affliction just yet. But let's read verse 8. Now it says, now there arose up a king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. And he said unto his people, behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass that when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies and fight against us, and so get them up out of the land. Therefore, they set over them taskmasters, listen, to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Python and Ramses. All right. So we can at least see that at this point, when the Pharaoh that arose that knew not Joseph, he was the one that started the affliction, right? He was the one that started the affliction. And we can see that in verse 11. All right. So now that we understand that, let's pick that back up at verse 17, where it says, but when the time of the promise drew nigh, which Elohim had sworn to Abraham, the people grew and multiplied in Egypt. All right. We just read that in Exodus, right? The first chapter, till another king arose, which knew not Joseph. All right. We read that as well. And so we also saw that the affliction didn't start until this king that knew not Joseph arose. But let's keep reading to see if this affliction lasted for 400 years. And verse 19, it says, the same dealt subtly with our kindred, and evil entreated our fathers, so that they cast out their young children, to the end that they might not live. All right. They tried to kill the children, in which time Moshe was born. Oh, now that's a big clue. It says, so at the time that this king arose that knew not Joseph, verse 18, verse 20 says, in which time Moses or Moshe was born. So, and we know that Moses, he grew up in that at the age of 80, he left Egypt. Between verse 18, which tells us that the affliction started with this king, which knew not Joseph. And also during this time, Moshe was born, who then took the children of Israel out of Egypt within 80 years. We can then see that this affliction did not last 400 years. I'll say it again. We can now see between verses 18 and verses 20 that this affliction did not last 400 years. All right. So that is the math problem of Acts chapter 7. The math problem has to do with the 400 years of being afflicted. And also the math problem has to do with the interpretation or the grouping of verses 5 and 6, which are two separate prophecies, which were given at two different times in Genesis. One was given earlier in the day. One was given later in the day. However, when we read Stephen's account in Acts, we tend to lump 5 and 6 together, not knowing that they were two different prophecies given at two different times in the day. All right, so let's do a brief recap. So we started off by taking a look at the two different views of the 400 years. Was it in America or was it in Egypt? Was it in the daughter of Babylon or was it in Egypt? Was it with the so-called African Americans or was it with our forefathers in Egypt? And when we went through that, we made sure that we keyed on the two requirements for the 400 years, enslavement and persecution or oppression for 400 years. And we found that we could identify oppression and enslavement for 400 years in America. And in fact, this is the 400th anniversary of when that started. And then we also pointed out that in America, this 400 years so happens to be in the daughter of Babylon, which is the nation that is called out for judgment in the last days. And then when we took a look at Egypt, we noticed that there were some math problems. We know that there were some discrepancies. One of the things we looked at, we took a look at Kohath, Amram, and Moshe. Kohath was the one that went into Egypt. He had a son, Amram, which is Moshe's father. And then Moshe came out and we added those up and we found that that was less than 400 years. So that was a math problem or a problem with making Egypt the place of the 400 years. And then we took a look at Stephen, at the account of Stephen's. And then we used Stephen's account to also show that Egypt was not the location of the 400 years of persecution, because according to Stephen's, the persecution didn't start until a Pharaoh that knew not Joseph arose. And that was during the time of Moshe. And at that time, they were coming out 80 years later. All right. So one last thing before we go. You know that we are in the last days. And Israel, we must be prepared for what's to come. Now, you being the children of Israel, you may not know, but you have superpowers. That's right. Just like Superman can jump tall buildings in the single bound, he's bulletproof, right? He has his X-ray vision and his laser beam eyes. Just like Batman has his tool belt, right? The children of Israel have their superpowers. So once you know that you are the children of Israel, you need to get acquainted with your superpowers. All right. So Brother Benayah, what are you talking about? So look, let's take a quick look at two scriptures. Let's take a look at Acts chapter 16, verse 25. So Acts chapter 16, verse 25. And let's take a look at the superpowers of Israel. And this is when the Apostle Paul, or Shaul, was arrested. Right. And we can pick this up in, let's start with verse 22. Yeah, verse 22. And it reads, it says, "And the multitudes rose up together against them, and the magistrates rent off their clothes and commanded to beat them. And when they had laid many stripes upon them, they cast them into prison, charging the jailer to keep them safely, who having received such a charge, thrust them into the inner prison." So he in other words, he put them deep, deep into prison, right? "And made their feet fast in the stocks." All right. So they bound their feet. All right. Verse 25 reads, "And at midnight, Shaul, or the Apostle Paul, and Silas prayed and sang praises to Elohim. And the prisoners heard them. And suddenly there was a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the prison were shaken. And immediately all the doors were opened, and everyone's bands were loosed." Oh, hallelujah. All right, so you can see this is an example of Yisrael using their superpower, praise and singing. Notice that when the Apostle Paul and Shaul were bound up, locked away in prison, they had lost their freedom. Notice that they prayed and sang praises unto the Most High Yah, and the Most High Yah freed them. Superpowers. Now let's take another look when the children of Yisrael used their superpowers. All right, so let's go over to 2 Chronicles chapter 20, and let's start at verse 20. So 2 Chronicles chapter 20, verse 20, and it reads, "And they rose early in the morning and went forth into the wilderness of Tekoa. And as they went forth, Jehoshaphat stood and said, Hear me, O Yehudah, and you inhabitants of Jerusalem. Believe in Yahuwah your Elohim, so shall you be established. Believe his prophets, so shall you prosper." Verse 21. "And when he had consulted with the people, he appointed singers unto Yah, and that should praise the beauty of holiness as they went out before the army." So they're going to battle. "And to say, Praise Yah, or Hallelujah, for his mercy endures forever." So here are the children of Israel going before the armies saying, Hallelujah. They're praising the Most High Yah, saying Hallelujah with their singers, right? With their singers going out to battle with their singers. Verse 22, and it reads, "And when they began to sing and to praise, Abba Yah set ambushments against the children of Ammon, Moab, and Mount Seir, which were come against Judah, and they were smitten. For the children of Ammon and Moab stood up against the inhabitants of Mount Seir, utterly to slay and destroy them. And when they had made the end of the inhabitants of Seir, or Esau, every one helped to destroy another. And when Judah came toward the watchtower in the wilderness, they looked unto the multitude, and behold, they were dead bodies fallen to the earth, and none escaped." Hallelujah. So again, you see Judah, before going out to battle, They use their superpowers, praise and prayer. So Yisrael, as we attempt to endure to the end, make sure you are using your superpowers, singing and praising the Most High Yah, and you will be victorious. Hallelujah. All right, my brothers and sisters. Shalom.